I always mess this up. Perfect. Okay. So welcome everyone. This is the first event of our Judaism and Criminal Justice speaker series with Evie Litwalk, who is just incredible. And I will try to give a fair bio for her, but she just does so much work. So Evie is the founder and executive director of Witness to Mass Incarceration. Her experiences with the judicial and correctional system serve as the inspiration behind Witness's mission, which operates to place formerly incarcerated women and LGBTQ plus people at the forefront of the movement to end mass incarceration, restore safety, dignity, and respect in correctional facilities, and reduce barriers to successful reentry. Since Evie has an incredible story that she's going to share with us, and I don't want to give too much away there, but since leaving prison, Evie has continued to be an outspoken advocate for ending mass incarceration. She has spoken at universities, community centers, synagogues, and also the White House. And she's also appeared on news channels and has written several articles for outlets such as The Medium, The Nation, and The Forward. In 2019, she was honored by the Jewish Women's Foundation of New York, and we're so grateful to have her here with us tonight. She's going to share her powerful story and the ways in which she connected with her Jewish identity while she was incarcerated. So without further ado, I'll pass things over to Evie.
So I want to thank you, Julia, for inviting me to speak. And I want to encourage those of you who are willing to show me your faces so that while I'm speaking, I get to see such gorgeous faces instead of names. So I am a formerly incarcerated Jewish lesbian and the child of 2 survivors of the Holocaust. And I say that because those intersections impacted my life in prison and post-prison. I was released 5 years ago. And just as my parents bore witness to the Holocaust, I consider the work I'm doing as bearing witness to mass incarceration. And some of the details, some of the graphic details that I'll be talking about may be triggering for some people. So I just want to tell you that in advance. A little bit about my background. My parents are Holocaust survivors. My mother was a teenager when she entered Auschwitz. My father, also a teenager, was in 12 labor and concentration camps. And I grew up through the lens of a Holocaust, meaning for me, it was not a historical event that ended April 1945 when my parents were liberated, but it was a living and fluid experience because I lived it through them. And it impacted the way I thought and the way I saw the world. My parents brought me up to say whatever they could do to Jews, they could do to other people. And it is your responsibility, meaning me personally, to make sure that whatever happens around the world that you respond. So that's the lens I'm talking about. In 2009 and 10, I was living with my mother who had difficulty hearing, seeing, speaking, and walking. I was her nurse. And even though she was physically challenged, she insisted on coming to sentencing with me. Now, she lived in central New Jersey and I was sentenced in eastern Long Island. So a one-way ride was anywhere between 3 and 5 hours, and she insisted on doing it and wasn't in the kind of physical shape. So she went before the judge, all 4'9" of her, and she said, Your Honor, I'm a Holocaust survivor. I have suffered enough for a lifetime. My daughter, she's been a fantastic daughter. She's been doing everything for me. She feeds me, she shops for me, she gets my medications. I will die without her. I can't even exist one day without her. To which the judge, the Jewish judge, said, I'm sorry, but she's going to prison. So we went home and I was leaving for prison the next day. And you unpack when you go to prison. You take nothing to prison. You don't take jewelry, you don't take a pocketbook, you take nothing and you walk. So I was packing away things and making lists for whoever was going to take care of my mother, of her doctors. And she walked in with this very serious look on her face and said, I want to talk to you. So that was, I stood up and she said, prison is going to be harder for you than concentration camp was for me. And I looked at her, I said, are you crazy, Mom? You were in Auschwitz. How can you compare the two? And she said, I was 12 years old and you're 60. And it would be years later when I was in solitary confinement that I would remember my mother's words. And she said, I was a child. You're an old woman. I wasn't crazy about the old woman part, but you're an old woman. And you've had an entire life, because I was 60 when I went into prison. And she said, you're going to think about it every day. And that's the difference. And she was right. The moment that I entered prison, I knew I was no longer in the free world. I arrived at a federal women's prison in West Virginia in 2010. An officer took me into a cold and dingy room. I had to strip naked in front of this stranger. I had to pee in front of her. Then she asked me to lift my breasts so she could check to see if I had any contraband underneath. And then she asked me to bend over and cough so she could check my anus and my vagina to make sure I didn't bring in drugs. And at that 10 seconds that I was bent over and coughing for this stranger, I was more humiliated than at any moment of my life. And in that 10 seconds, I knew that whatever I felt, I couldn't show. I had to shut down emotionally. I couldn't show a feeling. And I had to find, I knew I would have to find a zone or a coping mechanism to deal with what I was about to deal with. And that all happened in that 10 seconds. Um, so as soon as you're assigned to an admissions unit where you stay the first 2 weeks of prison, it's not the same in state or jails or federal prison. I was in federal prison. They call us newbies. And if you watched Shawshank Redemption, you know, when the newbies come in on the bus, everybody knows who they are. So we wear different clothes than other people. That first 24 hours, you're very identified as a new person. And I went into the unit, and some of the veterans approached me and said, if you want to stay under the radar, and if you want to do easy time, you have to stay under the radar. And that meant having no officer or the warden or anybody know your name. Well, I was a baby of the women, gay rights, and civil rights movement. And I was an old, experienced activist, and there was no way I could check my activism at the door. So it took less than an hour for me to be on everybody's radar. And this is how it happened. So you're allowed to bring in 25 pictures when you go to prison. And people, the first person walked over to me, said, are you married? Do you have children? They want to see your pictures. I said, no, I'm not married. I don't have children. Second person walks over. Are you married? Do you have children? No, I'm not married. I don't have children. And after the fourth woman walked over and asked me the same question, I thought to myself, I've been out for 4 decades, 40 years. I am not going back in the closet because I'm in prison. That was a mistake. I came out to my mother in my 20s, my very, 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 very progressive mother, who went Anatevka on me, started spitting on the floor and said, if Hitler didn't kill me, you will, which I thought was the funniest thing I'd ever heard, and is the title of a book I've been trying to write for years. And she also said to me, all the Kohanim, my mother is a Kohen, and her grandparents were brothers and Kohanes, so she considered herself a double Kohen. And she said to me, all the Kohanim are rolling in their graves. Now, I used to be impressed when she would tell me my grandfather was rolling in his grave, but that she knew they were all simultaneously rolling was extremely impressive. And that is, my mom is a character who I miss dearly. So as soon as I said that, this young woman said, can I see your pictures? And I said, sure. But what she didn't know is I brought 25 pictures of Allie. This is Allie. So she shrieked at the top of her lungs, this old white lesbian has 25 pictures of her dog. That was it. I was finished. The entire compound of 1,300 women in every sleeping section, every officer and the warden knew, I was old, Jewish, a lesbian, and had a white dog. So much for being under the radar. But, not kidding around, it made my life extremely dangerous that I didn't understand that I didn't understand what I had just done. Now, prior to my incarceration, and I was at 60, the last time I didn't attend synagogue regularly since my brother's bar mitzvah, which was 45 years earlier. I'm very Jewish. I'm very traditional, but I didn't go on weekends to services, and I avoided them. And the first day I was in prison, almost an hour after I got my the the sort of mattress they give you to sleep on, I was looking for a Siddur, a prayer book, which considering which is amazing, and I found myself saying Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad all day, every day. It just came out. I kind of know where it came out, and if we have time at the end, remind me, I'll tell you where I think that came from. But it came from my parents, obviously, in years of memory. Um, Within about a week or 10 days of me being on this unit, the unit manager called me up to her office, and she said, I understand you're an open lesbian. And I could feel myself getting really pissed off really quickly. And I said, I'm also an open Jew and an open feminist, because I didn't want her to make a certain kind of statement. She didn't care. She continued, several women have complained that you're touching their buttocks. I had to think for a minute what a buttocks was. I realized it was a tushy. And I said, how I started screaming at this officer. I'm in prison 10 days. And I'm screaming at an officer, how dare you accuse me? I haven't been with a woman in decades. And you think I'm going to start in here? I demand to see my accusers. You know, I must have thought I was in a courtroom as opposed to a prison. And I yelled a little bit more. She ignored me. And by the time I walked from her office down a flight of stairs, they had already moved my bed from this admission unit, which is quiet and supposed to gear you towards being in prison, to a place they call the ghetto, which is extremely noisy. What she didn't know is I was much more comfortable with the people in the ghetto than I was with the people, with her people. So the first thing they did, I never got a job, or I never got a sleeping, a place to sleep that was normal, because I had come out as a lesbian. So they put me in a place called the bus stop. Now, for you, try to imagine 120, 150 women in a dorm room setting with bunk, like two people in a bunk in each little tiny cubicle. So you've got about 130 women that are in the sleeping area. And in front of the sleeping area is a place called the bus stop that had 10 double beds that if I put my foot down, the person across from me would be stepping on my foot if they were down. That's how close the beds were on top of each other. Right in front of us was an ice machine, which came crashing down. Every 20 minutes, ice was crashing down. On either side of us were the bathrooms. So we were right next to the bathrooms where people were, 120 or 150 women were flushing toilets and taking showers all night. But the worst part was prison uses fluorescent lighting as a means of torture. And what I mean by that is if you sit under fluorescent lighting enough, you will get a headache. And in prison, the entire wall, not just one light, is fluorescent lighting. So it ends up triggering a lot of people to have seizures, a lot of people to have migraines. And what they do is at 11 o'clock in the sleeping unit, they close the lights. But in the bus stop, we're sleeping literally 6 feet away from the fluorescent lights because the ceiling is low. So the person on the top bunk can't sleep, and I couldn't sleep. And that was the point of putting people in the bus stop. That was torture, and prison is about torture. And make no mistake, they torture you every single day. And it has and will continue to impact me every day of my life, what happened to me in prison. Now, all women are forced to work. Most older women over 60, are given jobs where they can mop a floor and then read a book and sit down for an hour. But what they did with me is they gave me a broom, and I was in West Virginia in the mountains in 100-degree weather most of the summer. So it's between 90 and 100 degrees. They put me on landscaping, and they asked me to sweep with a broom rocks off the street, try sweeping a big rock off a street, doesn't move. And it requires a lot of energy. And as I was sweeping the streets, I remembered a story my mother told me. I never met my mother's father, my grandfather. My mother described him as a tall, handsome man with jet black hair and a jet black beard. And after the Germans came into Poland in 1939, and my mother lived in Lodz, they took the businessmen and the Jewish leaders out of the area and took them away for 3 weeks and beat them horribly. And my mother hadn't seen her father in 3 weeks, but when he came back on the truck with the rest of the men, she looked at him and freaked out because he was completely gray and he was permanently bent over from the beatings. And he was no longer the tall father with the black hair. And to further humiliate them, the Nazis made the women and children come downstairs and made the men sweep the streets in front of them. And as I was sweeping the streets every day, I could feel the grandfather I never met sweeping right next to me. Now, I was arrested in 1997. I didn't go to trial for 12 years. It wasn't a strong case. I was convicted on 3 counts of tax evasion, 1 count of mail fraud. I usually encourage people not to ask any formerly incarcerated people what they were in prison for so that you don't identify them with the worst thing they ever did in their life. But as part of my talk, I identify it. Beginning in 1997 and for the next 12 years, the government wanted me to plead. And much to their frustration, I didn't. And I wouldn't because I plan to still try to file an innocence complaint, but my work is more important to me than clearing my name, so I haven't done that. But someday I'll find an attorney who'll file an innocence claim. What they did, though, is they had me come to Long Island once a week, and they would get these big, I'm 5 feet, and they'd get these tall men in jackets in the building, in outerwear that looked like mafia guys. And they would put me in a small room, which was like a closet. And they would say, well, it's Thanksgiving. And if you don't plead guilty, we're going to change it. We're going to make sure you go to prison for life. And I thought to myself, these people are nuts, but they can do that to you, which is what I learned. It didn't happen to me. But they'd call and say, the second week it would be, and we'll make sure you'll get raped. And the third week is, if you don't plead guilty, we're going after your parents. And that's where they get everybody to plead guilty. That's almost every woman I was incarcerated with who pled guilty to avoid the arrest of another family member. That was one reason. Now, I wouldn't plead guilty. I talked to my parents and they went after them and it stressed out. And I think, cut my father's life short, but they did not get their assets, which is what they were trying to do. They wanted to make sure I had no way to go to trial. So my case started in 1997, took 12 years. I was incarcerated. My conviction was overturned. I was reincarcerated on 1 count. And in 2017, I went off probation. So I spent 20 years involved in every part of the justice movement. The justice system, although we like to call it the criminal punishment system instead of justice system. The one area, though, that you get to decide, the one area of relief for those of us who are in prison was religion. You could change your religion every week. So if you wanted to, you could change your religion, and people did. I started going to Friday night services the first week I was in prison, and most of the people who went to Friday night services were not Jewish. They just wanted to go to services. People wanted to believe in something. 6 weeks prior to Passover, women who identify as Jewish, who self-identify as Jewish, get a list of kosher for Passover foods that they can buy and spend extra money on. So, there is no chocolate covered macaroons in prison, and there are no chocolate covered matzah in prison. So I'm sitting looking at this list, and I've got about 20 women. I want in on that. Get me some of that matzah stuff, So you're spending all your money. And also 6 weeks before this list arrives, 35 women convert to Judaism because they want the chocolate covered matzah. But it's not only the matzah. We get 2 nights, 5 hours a night, where we're free from hell and without officers. So I could sing in Hebrew, and so could my friend Marika. And she said, "Why don't you do the Manishtana? Why don't you start us?" So I start singing Manishtana, Halayla Hazeh, and I finish, and everybody was applauding. And I looked at her. I said, "They think this is a Broadway show. They don't understand that this is a service." But anyway, everybody enjoyed the matzah and all the food, and then came Ramadan, and everybody converted to Muslim. And that's how it went. And there was a Native American sweat tank. And if you wanted to go in there, you converted to being a Native American who wanted to be in a sweat tank. There was, anyway, it went on and on. Now in prison, both prisons, medical care is non-existent. No matter what anybody will tell you, no matter what a medical officer will tell you, I will tell you that there's no doctor on the compound. You're seen once by a doctor at the beginning, and you have a physician's assistant who sees all 1,300 women. And they call, when you go, you're allowed to go to see this person 3 times at 6:30 in the morning. And if you have a broken leg and you go at 6:30 in the morning, what they do is they take your name and you get to see someone 6 weeks later. So if you've got a broken leg, which many, many people did, because we were forced to wear steel-toed boots, and it broke our foot. Steel-toed boots that were required for every job we did. And they broke my toes, and they broke everybody's toes. Anyway, whether you had a cyst or cancer, or you needed something, there were no machines in the prison, and they didn't send anybody out of prison unless you were practically dead. So I went into prison, and I had just come out of the hospital with colon surgery, and I was bleeding. And I was bleeding constantly. I called an officer over because they don't believe you. The officer saw the blood, and that happened in January. I got to get a colonoscopy in July. Now, normally, if you're bleeding, you could die in 20 minutes. If it's something serious, they don't take it serious. If you have cancer, you're basically going to die inside prison. Now, a woman named Miriam, what this guy did is no matter what injury you had or what illness you had, he said the same thing to all 1,300 women. You're fat, walk on the track, drink water. So when a woman I know named Miriam Hernandez went in to see him for severe pain and she couldn't move, he gave her the fat speech, and she died 2 weeks later when her gallbladder burst. And I was outraged. And I had been, they tell you not to ask anybody their story in prison. I asked everybody their story because I wanted to write about it. And the reason they gave it to me is they realized I wasn't FBI, that I was just an old Jewish activist, and so people told me. But I would write stories, send them snail mail, and then they would get posted. But I was so upset about her death and about another friend going blind because they didn't take her out to the doctor. So she just went blind. I wrote an article blaming the officer, not naming him, and saying a simple blood test would have saved this woman's life. I emailed it, and they read all your emails and they listen to all your phone calls. There are officers whose entire jobs are just emails and phone calls, which is astonishing. Anyway, I emailed it. An hour after it was posted, I was arrested, I was shackled, and I was sent to solitary confinement and told, and this was 3 weeks before I was to be released. So they said, now they could have kept me for my entire 3 years of probation. And they threatened to do that. And they can keep you, they can just extend your time as long as they want. Solitary is something that shouldn't be in this country. And we should stop talking about ending it. We should start ending it. Solitary is a prison within a prison run by usually 4 people who answer to no one. In where I was, it's sometimes called solitary, it's sometimes called segregated housing, the SHU, it's called a lot of things, it's all the same thing. You're in a very small cage, locked up for 24 hours a day. And if they feel like letting you out for the hour you're permitted, if it's not raining or snowing or they're not in a bad mood, they do let you out for that hour. But it's sometimes not worth it because you have to get shackled and walk down a flight of stairs and you almost fall because you're shackled, and they don't help you. So it's a terrible situation. There were 60 women in solitary, and they were all, and women's prisons are different than men's prisons. Women do not talk back. Men will go on hunger strikes, but women's prisons, nobody talks back because 75% of the women in every women's prison are mothers, and they want their visitation with their children. And if they say or do anything, that's the first thing an officer does. So uh, when I was incarcerated, I heard an officer say to a woman right next to me, "Do you want to see your kids this weekend?" And she looked at him like, "Of course I do." And he said, "Then I want a blowjob." And this woman, I hope I didn't offend anybody, but I want you to hear exactly what happened. This woman had to sleep with this officer because if she didn't, two things would have happened. She would have been sent to solitary confinement, in which case she would not have her visitation, or the visitation would be limited to 45 minutes while she's in an orange jumpsuit and all shackled. And most people do not want their kids to see them shackled like that. Or if the officer had slept with the woman and then was concerned that the woman might report him, he might take her from Florida, where her kids are and where she's incarcerated, and send her to a prison, transfer her to Waseca in Wisconsin or Dublin in California. So they have unlimited, they have an extraordinary amount of power that no human being should have. So the solitary was filled with 60 women. Um, I was kept there for about 7 weeks, a month past my release date. And I can tell you, I've never recovered physically, emotionally, or mentally from it. I have lots of triggers, lots of scars, and lots of things I can't do. So you walk in and you're, of course, strip searched. You're given a t-shirt, underwear, and a jumpsuit, and a thin blanket. And that's it. They keep the temperature below 60 degrees. So I had to wear all the clothes they gave me all the time and the blanket. And if you ask for a second blanket, they deny it. And if you ask them to raise the temperature, they laugh at you. And for you to understand solitary, I want you to envision the following. Each of you has a private bathroom, right? Everybody has a bathroom. I want you to pretend or think about going into your own bathroom. What you have in there is a toilet, and where your bathtub or your shower is going to be your metal bed with a mattress that's about a tenth of an inch, where you'll have a sink, not the sink you have, no window, no computer, no books, no radio, no writing, no pencil, no knitting, no nothing. You sit in that room, and I'll bring you 3 meals a day, and it's locked. By a show of hands, how many of you think you could actually stay in your bathroom doing absolutely nothing for 24 hours? Nobody can. It's inhuman. And if you want to feel even an ounce of what solitary is like, try it. Try going into your own bathroom with nothing and seeing how long you can sit there before your mind goes crazy. Because what happens is your mind eats at you. Now, I did share a cell with a woman who was a little older than I was, a Jewish woman who was older, and she was used to her husband and kids coming up every weekend. And she was freaked out. Every Friday, she started banging her head against the wall till she was bleeding. And being in a room with her, it's very hard to keep your sanity if you're worrying that somebody else right next to you is going to commit suicide. Because now you're having to deal with them and you and not knowing what to do. And I don't know that this woman wasn't released. They just did it to be mean to her, but it's a horrible situation. Now, the first day of solitary, I had vertigo, which I never had in my life. The room was spinning. I had severe migraine, which I also didn't regularly have. And so I had vertigo, high blood pressure, and a migraine. Now, I knew I had high blood pressure because I lived with it, and I knew the headache had to be from that. So I begged each officer, anybody who, I stood at the door cell and begged them to let someone take my blood pressure. I said, both sides of my family have died from heart disease. So 2 weeks after I was in solitary, they took my blood pressure and it was 200 over 100. And I said, will you take me to the hospital? I'm at risk. And the guard said, well, we get $75,000 if you die. And then he left. And that was it. And they let me stay there without an EKG, without nothing for 7 weeks. And I not only didn't think I would live through it, but I'll tell you in a minute what happened. They give you a roll of toilet paper. And when you run out and you ask the guard for another roll, he looks at you and says, wipe yourself. I didn't move a muscle on my face. I'm going to use some bad language right now, but I want you to understand exactly what I felt. I said, you motherfucker, I am not going to give you the benefit of seeing any reaction from me when you're not giving me a roll of toilet paper. And you learn in prison not to show those feelings. And he gave it to me a few days later because he didn't care. There are 60 women. It's an echo chamber. And again, I'm sorry for the language, but I don't want to sanitize this at all. What you hear 24 hours a day in solitary are women screaming, not simultaneously, but 24 hours a day, get me the fuck out of here. And to this day, I cannot be in a room that's noisy. I sometimes can't be in my synagogue. And I have to sit on the aisle near the door so I have an escape route. A lot of women tried to commit suicide. Some succeeded. And you could hear it. And you could hear people trying to commit suicide. I personally didn't want to commit suicide, but I looked up at God and I said, I've had a great life and it would be really okay if I didn't wake up tomorrow. And there were many, many days where I was hoping that God would just take me because it was that hard to be in solitary confinement. You also don't know what day or time it is. It's disorienting. There are no windows. Unless you go outside for the hour a day, you don't know anything. So I hadn't been outside. They didn't let me go outside. And all of a sudden, I heard the chaplain call my name. I didn't know the chaplain. I had no idea why the chaplain would say Litwalk. And I saw him put something in the food slot, which was 3 pieces of matzah and grapefruit juice. And I realized it was Friday night. Part of our Jewish services on Friday night was either matzah or challah and grape juice. And when I saw the matzah and the grape juice, I started sobbing. And I grabbed it. I didn't want them to see me cry because you can't cry in prison at all. It's a sign of weakness. I put my face down. I grabbed the items. I put them on the little desk. I made the prayers quietly. And at that moment, because of what he did, I remembered who I was. And I knew I had the strength to survive, just like my mother. It took that. I was released from prison shortly after my time in solitary. I'm one of the 700,000 people that come home every year from prison. We have moved from mass incarceration. We have moved from slavery to mass incarceration. And now we moved into an era of mass supervision, or what people call correctional control. So there's 2.3 million people in prison, but there's close to 5 million people under correctional control. So when you get sentenced by a judge for 2 years, he has the arbitrary right to say, well, you're going to be on probation for 3 years longer. And that, to me, just, there has to be a way to challenge the subjectivity of being able to sentence people 10 years to be under probation, because it limits what you can do. You're on an ankle monitor. You have to report in. I wasn't permitted to leave Manhattan without permission. So anytime I wanted to go to Queens or Brooklyn or visit my mother in New Jersey, I had to go in, and get P-tested and get permission. So you can't start a life. Um, I you cannot start a life easily like that. What I will say to you is as decarceration calls grow louder and are heard, we are seeing an entire e-monitoring industry booming right now and quietly getting bigger and bigger. And we should be afraid of that industry, because I have someone who I work with who was arrested but not convicted and is facing her future. And the e-monitor follows her every minute. She's not, if she were to walk into a store, it would go off. So you have to have a person following you 24 hours a day, which is a whole new industry, which is what they want, because they want to just make money off of this industry continually. But e-monitoring is not a new industry. It started as bail bonds in the 1700s. And it's really interesting to read the history of this. And if anybody wants some good information, I'll send it to Julia if you remind me. There's one particular piece. Now, I can tell you coming home was worse than being in prison. I walked out of prison. I was given $30 and a Greyhound bus ticket, and I arrived home in New York at Port Authority to no one. My mother was not able to help me, and I did not have a relationship with my brother. Um, Walking into Port Authority alone, coming out of prison, I found again myself overwhelmed. And it's a place I had been to a million times before, but I had to go into a corner and cry. I went to every nonprofit organization serving formerly incarcerated people, or practically everyone. I might have missed one. And they offered absolutely no long-term way to build your life. What reentry, which none of us like that word, and we're trying to change that word. I, I'm changing it to a path to freedom, success, safety, and success. That's my new definition for people being released. But what the two things that are available for people who come out of prison are transitional housing, and that's that's the housing we get, whether it's in a shelter, in a correction control facility. So you've moved out of living with 130 women to living with 24 women, and you're still sharing a bathroom, and you're still under rules and regulations. You can only go out 45 minutes to look for a job. You have to attend programs. They wanted me to attend childbearing parenting programs. And I said, I'm 65, I had a hysterectomy. There's not a chance in hell I'm going to be a parent. You have to do it. And they do that kind of thing. So they're offering you programs that are irrelevant and in transitional housing. And in the nonprofits that serve us, they offer what I call transactional stuff: a meal, a MetroCard, employment training, a resume. Each of these things may have a benefit for 5 minutes, but you cannot start a life when you're in transitional housing, or you're having to report back to your counselor every hour on the hour. So I had been in the labor market 30 years. I'd been on Wall Street 12 years. I'd run a nonprofit. I had a lot of skills. I sent out 200 job applications. I didn't hear from anyone. I spent 16 months homeless and penniless. I lived in situations, if I took you to, you'd throw up, because they were, and you have to deal with it because you don't have another choice. I was living in, uh, I was living in one shelter that had a lot of people who were still drug addicted, and um, it had no heat. So one person decided to go open the oven and turn on the heat, turn on the gas. And then she brought a chair over to smoke a cigarette next to the open gas. And I thought to myself, if I didn't die in prison, I'm absolutely going to get blown up in this house. It's really bad what's out there. So I also understood poverty for the first time, because I had $1 to spend. And every day I had to make the choice between a 30-cent bagel or $1 piece of pizza. And that was it. It's not the way I wanted to eat, but it's all that I had. And it's the only choice I had. So after being homeless for 16 months, and I couldn't get my dog, she was stuck at a horrible place because you can't have a dog in a shelter. Um, I ran into an old friend who was also a baby of the women's movement, and I hadn't seen her in 20 years. And she said, "Where have you been?" And I said, "Prison." And she said, or when she realized I had no place to live, she said, "You're not going to stabilize until we find you housing." So she happened to know I'm living in a building she brought me to. It's senior low income housing. If I hadn't had this friend who knew the guy who ran it, I would not have gotten in here. But even when I walked in the door and I said to her, all I have is my Social Security, and if I take this studio, then I will have no money to eat with. Because in shelters, you pay $400 to live. But in an apartment, I'm using my whole Social Security. She said, "Don't worry, I'll get you a job." In less than a week, she realized there was no job to get for me because of my conviction and because I had come out of prison 64 years old. So she said, "I know you have a lot of pride, but I am going to give you $1,000 a month for a year. And you're going to live in here and you're going to start Witness." And she saved my life. That 1 year safety net took me out of a depression that was so bad. And I'm not a depressed person, I'm an optimistic person. But that one human being took me out of I was a place where I was almost ready to stand in front of a subway, and she gave me my life. And I formed Witness not only to place voices of women and LGBTQ people who have the least amount of services at the center to make change, but because I wanted to create initiatives to help them. And I understood that we have four needs: permanent housing, permanent employment. That means not a $9 an hour job. Trauma-informed care or self-care, teaching us, you come out damaged. You cannot be in prison without coming out traumatized and damaged and triggered in ways that you can't imagine. And community support. For people who've been in prison a long time, their family's dead, there's no community to come back to. So I first started, are we good on time? Are we okay? Okay.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, I started because of my background as a Holocaust survivor's child. I knew that Steven Spielberg took 55,000 interviews of Holocaust survivors in 1995, and I knew the benefits of that was that 150 museums and colleges had 55,000 interviews where you could not deny the Holocaust. It was too powerful an instrument. And so I started by creating a digital library to do in a very small way, because I don't have this funding, to interview people about life before, during, and after, and create a digital library that I would eventually give to a university that shows you the same story over and over and over. The Death March, our version is solitary confinement. It's the same story. But I also realized that when I came out of prison, coming out alone to nobody was the hardest moment of my life. So I approached my two synagogues and I asked them to raise $2,000 to give a suitcase to someone who will come out of prison. And that suitcase included a computer, a phone with minutes for a year, and then gift certificates, $100 food, which doesn't go that far, $100 Metro card, which is for 1 month, and then the rest for clothes. So even though the 2,000 sounds like a lot, it doesn't. The phone and the computer are the main things. But in addition to the stuff, I said, I want members of the congregation to meet her as she comes out and take her out for her first meal, and then be a source for her. So we did that. We did that for 3 people. And to this day, each of them, one of them is back in prison, because there's absolutely no way that someone could live through COVID without a job and not steal. No way. If you have no family to give you money and you have no job and you have to eat, how are you going to do it? I look at people who steal food differently today than I did before. So the Suitcase Project, which started, I received 135 letters almost immediately, The need was so great, I stopped the project because I couldn't do it one at a time. And now we are trying to raise, I'm trying to get a team of people. And if anybody wants an internship and wants to call corporations with me, we have lots of pieces of this to do. We're trying to get corporations to donate 100 suitcases, to donate 100 computers, and to get them in the habit of donating this to everybody that comes out of prison so that they can start a life. So maybe you start off with one, or maybe you try to do it for 100. But when you interview them and you see the difference between someone who gets help and someone who doesn't, you understand we're not helping anybody at this moment in time. We mean well, but we're really not helping. So that's the suitcase project. And um, I can't tell you enough. I attend services every week. My mom died of COVID this past April, so every morning I say Kaddish for her, and every day I read the words of Judaism, and I say we are just not doing what we say we want to do. We think it, we feel it, but we have to take it one step further in order to have a real impact on people's lives. And I will tell you that had I not gone to prison, I would be retired and living in East Hampton, in the house I was living in. And I would be spending my life doing what I thought was philanthropy, going to meetings, going to rallies, working on legislation, and believing in my heart that I was making a difference. I will tell you, having been in prison, that does not make enough of a difference. While it's important, it doesn't. The only person who saved my life was the woman who gave me a year to rebuild my life and gave me that $1,000 a month. Giving people a safety net and a way to rebuild a life after prison is the only way there'll be no recidivism. It's the only way you help someone. And I'll say one more message, which is not in the order of my talk, which is it's not enough for us to collect coats in the winter and do a coat drive and a toy drive and give out turkeys. We have to change our mentality to helping one person every day. One homeless person, one formerly incarcerated person, give someone a meal every day, even if they're on the street, or take it to a shelter. But if we're not 365 days of awesome, which is what I'm trying to call it, if we're not doing it 365 days, we're not doing it at all. It's not enough. And you cannot check the box that says, I've done my, it's like corporations who hire a Black person for diversity and then don't hire anybody else. You do not get permission to check that box. You haven't changed a thing. So Witness does two other important projects. We do a bunch of things, but I'm working on, for years, eliminating sexual violence in prison. It's a huge problem. There was a law passed in 2003 called PREA, Prison Rape Elimination Act. And it said there is no officer, an officer who touches or looks at or flirts with or rapes a person is a criminal. 18 years later, I can tell you it's not been enforced. And the problem with the law is most good legislation doesn't get enforced and doesn't have to be accountable. Laws get passed and they seem good, but then they don't get funded or they don't get enforced. The second thing, which I think is going to make a huge change, is I invested in I built what's called the MAP. It's an online directory of formerly incarcerated led services and businesses. We're still working on it, and we have only 100 listed. But my plan is to list thousands of people across this country, and then to tell the public, if you want to help us, and if you want to see us succeed, buy your presents from us, get your haircut from us. I brought these glasses from a guy in Brooklyn who has a store. Go out of your way and support the people who need support. Also go to small businesses in your neighborhood. Support people who need your support. So I will send a message, and hopefully, just like me, the one or two business owners who sit in their homes and struggle. And I work 7 days a week, and I'm going to be 70 years old in July. And I work from 8:30 in the morning till as long as I can in the evening, sometimes not as long as others, because there's an urgency if you see how many people are in trouble. If you see the faces, if 700,000 people are released every year, that means 700,000 people, or close to it, let's say 600,000, are walking the streets with no food. And the only thing they know is prison. So they steal and they get rearrested. They don't, instead of an officer buying a meal, he puts them back. No, we must change the system. So anybody who wants to intern can help me populate the map. We are living in for me, very dangerous times. As a Jewish woman who's a child of survivors, on January 6th, the minute the riot started, I said Kristallnacht, and I wrote a piece. And if you look up my name and go to Medium, you'll see I have about 14, 15 articles, but look at the one on Kristallnacht. We are not who we think we are. We are a country in trouble. Towards the end of his life, Dr. Martin Luther King was very discouraged. I read that during the letter from a Birmingham jail that he wrote to white moderates, where he said, there are 4 steps to make change. You do 3 of them, but you don't do the 4th. You acknowledge the problem, you investigate the problem, you'll stand up for the problem, but will you put your body on the line for the problem? Will you walk across the Pettus Bridge? And most of us don't want to get beaten up. But the truth is, how are we going to change unless we go the full distance and demand change? Otherwise, in the 60s, I was part of the movement that worked on voting rights, that worked on Roe v. Wade. Look at those laws. How easy it is to throw out a law that 1 million people worked on. That's not how we're going to make change. He moved away from legislation towards the end of his life and totally focused on improving neighborhoods. In New York, we've got 29 neighborhoods that are poor and where formerly incarcerated people live and are low income. We have a business community every day that says they're committed to diversity. So I'll ask this question. Did those children, was there any corporation who decided to put Wi-Fi in every neighborhood where there's low income people? The hell with diversity. How can, even if you give a person living in a bad neighborhood or a difficult neighborhood a computer, what are they going to do with it if you haven't put Wi-Fi into that neighborhood? And seriously, how much would it cost for you to have less profit, but to give people a chance? Because without Wi-Fi, you can't do anything. And so we're full of shit. Most people, when they talk, do not want to get into a discussion with me, because I'll look at them and say, tell me what you did today. And as a movement, we need to demand that Wi-Fi, and believe me, that's an act of being a radical. If you can get Wi-Fi put into these neighborhoods, to me, you're heading with me. So since it's 8 o'clock, I'm going to thank you for listening, and I'm going to say this to you. I need help building an individual donor database. And if any of you have as little as $5, please join my army. Go to witnesstomassincarceration.org and every year give us $5. That makes a difference. Ask Bernie Sanders. Anything helps. If you don't want to help me, help someone. But make it a yearly commitment and stay with it. Stay with it, because help, and focus your giving and your attention on the organizations who are on the ground doing the work, that are on the ground doing the work. And if anybody needs a list of, or has a particular thing they want to hear about, write me. Go into Witness, add your name to our mailing list, and send me a note, and I'll answer it. And I'll call you and we'll talk about what you can do. So I need your help. We need your help. We need everybody's help. We need to change things as they are. They're going in the wrong direction on every level. So I thank you for listening. And now I'm open to any question. And by the way, at my age, you'll answer any question anybody asks you.
Thank you so much, Evie, for sharing your incredible story and for all of those amazing calls to action. I'm thinking about so much right now, and I know I have a million questions. But if anyone has a question, feel free to drop it in the chat or message me. But first, I want to ask you, Evie, since you have this emotional, really powerful story, how did you find the strength after incarceration to tell it? And how do you find the strength to tell it over and over again and sort of relive that?
I think the reason I have to credit my family, because when I was the kind of person who wanted to know about all the 70 relatives who died in the Holocaust from my father's side, and I wanted to hear the stories on my mother's side also. But they were my example. As soon, beginning in the late 70s, my parents started speaking publicly about their experience in the Holocaust to junior high school, and college. And even though I heard every story, when I would go to their talks, I would also always hear a new story. And I think that they modeled that behavior for me. And as a Jewish person of my faith, I feel compelled. I feel that it is a moral obligation that I speak. And it doesn't mean that there are times that after I speak like this, that I can't speak anymore for the rest of the evening. There are times that are difficult. I was in Los Angeles prior to COVID. I gave 4 talks in one day. I did 14 talks in 7 days. But on this one day, um, I had a pretty difficult schedule, and one of my board members, Paul, was with me, and we went home, and I looked at him and I said, I can't speak anymore. And he got it. I was wiped out. You you need to be authentic. You need to tell stories that impact people. And that's how you make a difference, by sharing your story. And it's not that you love doing this or that you're good at doing this. It's that you must do this. Otherwise, how will people know? And quite frankly, to a Jewish audience who looks at me, it's different seeing a person of color than seeing me, because I'm telling a story that I could be your mother or your grandmother. And that makes the story different, which is why I focus on synagogues. And I'm about to I speak at some churches and mosques, but I want to speak to white people who can look at me and it bothers them deeply, the words I say, and it needs to bother them. What I'm always afraid of is that when you have a Black person speaking about their experience, people do one of the 3 things you need to do. They get an education, they feel some empathy, but then they do nothing afterwards. And I feel, because I'm in community, that I can kind of whip you more into shape to do something. Or at least I hope so.
Thank you. I'll pass it to Becca, who has a question.
Yeah, first, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for sharing your story as well. It's very powerful and very insightful for me. I currently work as one of the coordinators of a student group at Tufts, which is called TREE, which is Tufts for Racially Equitable Endowment. And our main goal at this point is pushing for the university to divest for private prisons. And the group kind of started from me and some friends at the beginning of COVID, feeling a need to do something because the tutoring program through Tufts at the prisons nearby had been canceled because of COVID and all the rest. And this was a way we felt we could get involved. But I often struggle because I feel like it's not enough. It's not going to create enough meaningful change and things like that. And you were talking about the importance of not just giving one meal, but giving every day, and kind of not just giving, but giving meaningfully and acting meaningfully. And I'm wondering if you see of ways that, especially us as students, as young people, um, of actions that we can be taking that, from your experience, would make meaningful difference.
So what I'll tell you is, I'm willing to go on a Zoom call with anybody from this call next week, where we do nothing but discuss what you can do. Or the other option I have is to speak to you individually. But there are formerly incarcerated led organizations that desperately need a hand and help. Most of us don't know how to use a computer. Most of you do. Most of you know how to do social media to send out messages that we desperately need to send out. So just being able to do posting. I don't know how to post on Instagram, and I have a lot of things I'd like to post, only when I have someone helping me. So there is tons of places, and incidentally, divesting from private prisons will hurt them this much. Where they make their real money is in reentry, but what they make their serious money in transportation, which nobody talks about. So, for example, when I had to go with Conair, there is a Conair. It's a long story, and I don't want to. I'll see if I can shorten it. But basically, every form of transportation is controlled by two businesses that we need to put out of business. And private. When people say private prisons, that's just a tiny little fraction. The reentry, the correctional control, the supervision is huge, and it's all controlled by them. And the transportation is all controlled by them. And that's a whole, if you remind me, and we do have a call next week, I will give you a little history lesson on what's called transportations for aliens. It's got like 4 or 5 words in it, alien transport system. That's how they look at us. Does that help you, or would you like a more specific answer?
Maybe I'll give some space if others have questions, and if you want to return back.
Like I said, I'll talk to anybody on the phone also.
I actually have a question from Jenna that I wanted to share. So she said that she has family members that often use the Holocaust as a lesson for Jews to worry about themselves and think about preserving our community. But it's also important, she's highlighting that the same people understand how the Holocaust can be a lesson that's applied to other communities. And I think, especially in this case, to why we have to end mass incarceration. So how would you say we respond to those people that use the Holocaust as something that should only apply to the Jewish community?
Well, they don't want to compare the Holocaust necessarily to prison, but I have many answers. My first reaction to that is if we are true to our religion, we see everybody in God's image and we're all the same. You can't just take care of the Jewish community and your own. If you're deciding to just take care of the Jewish community and your own, you're isolating, you're separating, you're segregating, you're doing everything that the Bible doesn't want you to do. Integrate, be inclusive. You know, everything we behave very often like a little community trying to protect ourselves as if we're going to be destroyed if we don't behave that way. But the truth is, strength is about adversity. You get stronger when you take chances. You take stronger when you live through things. And my mother is the one who said to me, prison's going to be harder for you than the Holocaust was for me. If anybody has the right to say that, it's a person who was in Auschwitz. And that's how most survivors, when I talk to them about my experience, there are not many alive or not many in good shape, but they 100% agree. But you don't need to make a direct comparison, or, you know, the people who get offended are not the people you're going to work with. Because they get offended they would get offended if I said I'm a lesbian. Just using that word would offend them. An inactive lesbian.
Thank you. And I also wanted to ask you about the work that you do in terms of combating sexual violence in prisons and highlighting and amplifying the voices of survivors. I know there's also a video you wanted to share if you want to talk about that.
If I have 5 minutes to show a very difficult video, by a nodding or show of hands, are you willing to watch a 5-minute video? Yeah? Do you have the video, or you want me to get it?
It's the link that you sent in the chat earlier.
You're about to watch something. This is, in order to eliminate sexual violence, you have to get testimony from people who've experienced it. And the Shoah is my the videotape library is so important to me. So this is 5 minutes from about 5 hours of interviews, and we'll talk about it afterwards. Can you put it on the whole screen as opposed to just?
Yeah, it's loading. Let's get this going. Can everyone see that?
You can make it bigger and you can enhance the screen. Uh-oh.
Oh, you want full screen? Does that work?
Oh, no. Can you lower that?
Oh, is it really high? There we go.
What I would do is hit this thing.
Oh,
Okay, that's it.
Does it work? Okay.
Yep.
And let me know if you can hear the sound.
Hit play.
When I was arrested, they took me to Towns County Detention Center in Towns County, Georgia. And from that point on, I was harassed, bullied, and sexually assaulted nearly daily by another female inmate. She would physically overpower me and hold me down, and she would put her bare, naked vagina in my face. She also thought it was funny to urinate on me. I did not report her because I knew that there would be retaliation. I knew that there was no such thing as an anonymous report at this facility, and the corrections officers didn't care.
I was in a dormitory that had a wall full of open showers, and I was forced to shower in front of the entire unit. I've had many guys masturbate to me in front of the door. Trans people you're supposed to be given the opportunity to shower separately from all other inmates in the facility. That's something that didn't happen in my case, and that's something that's not happening in many other cases around the country.
I've had several fights in prison in protecting my body. And those fights haven't always been with inmates. They've also been with staff. There was no one to report to. There were no staff to tell.
I was walking around doing laps in the gym with a friend, and I was approached by the male officer. And he said, I need you to come with me for a second. He pushed me into the room, and it was like a storage room with that sports equipment and like a utility table in the room. And he got down to the waistband of my pants, and he pulled them down around my ankles and started rubbing up the insides of my legs. And I said, please don't. I said, please don't. And he grabbed me by the throat and stuck his thumb in my voice box so that I couldn't make a sound, and shoved my head down onto the table so that I couldn't move. He spit on my ass before he rubbed his penis in it, and then he penetrated me. And it was so forceful that it damaged my urethra, and I still have problems today. I was peeing blood for 3 days immediately after he assaulted me. He told me to pull up my pants, and he said, clean your face off. And then he said, next time you see me, you're gonna beg me to do it again. And if you never tell anybody, you'll never see your kids again. And so I left the room, and I had wiped off my face, and I went back to walking around and basically had to act like absolutely nothing happened at all. But I remember walking back to my dorm thinking, what happens in prison stays in prison. What happens in prison stays in prison. So I didn't report it, and I was determined not to take it home with me. But it came home with me anyway, because it ended a 12-year marriage. There is no Me Too movement behind the walls. Culture change has to come from the top, because those are the people who have control, and those are the people who can really enforce a change.
For a lot of people who are survivors of sexual abuse, the one thing you want is for people to understand what happened, and that what happened to you harmed you in some ways?
We received word that we were getting a new warden. And upon meeting this woman, we had a town hall meeting, and she basically said that she was going to uphold every law that needed to be upheld. If she could not handle your problem right then, she took your name, your number. She had someone come talk to you. She prevented sexual violence. She also brought in help. She brought in counseling for people that had been assaulted. She had officers transferred because she had heard that they were not good officers, but she couldn't get any evidence against them, but she had enough.
If you have wardens and administrators who will hold officers accountable for their behavior, and demand that all people in the facility are being respected, that includes the inmates, then yes, you're going to see a big change. You will see a whole lot less sexual assault. You'll see a whole lot less inmate on inmate assault.
You can say no sexual violence, but if you don't walk out onto your yard to see if it is being followed, then you leave all your people to do whatever they want. And if you don't want to see this in your institution, then you will make everybody accountable for it.
So that is part of the work Witness does. I interview people and then we edit clips to show. I have been wanting to take this particular clip and send it into a film festival to expose this issue. Tell me if a few of you don't mind, Julia, I'd love to hear some feedback on the film. If a couple of people would unmute and share some feedback or questions. Come on, there's one of you, be brave.
I would say that film was harrowing, and I think exactly the way it needed to be. It really gave a vivid image of the fight that we need to fight. And I appreciate that you guys are doing this work. It's really incredible.
The woman who spoke about losing her 18-year marriage with the white hair, when I interviewed her, she said to me, I was raped. And I said to her, nobody really knows what that means. I said, if you're comfortable, I want you to walk me through it. She said, literally? I said, literally, because that's the only way that people will understand. And that's why that is what she said. And what happened was the very next day we were on a panel and she gave that talk we had prepared. And she walked over to me and hugged me. She said, it's the most empowering thing I have ever done to say it. And it is empowering to tell a story when you're authentic. The minute you're not authentic, it doesn't work. So the sexual violence against women is real. Unfortunately, the sexual violence against men is equally real, but men won't talk about it. I will tell you one quick story. My rabbi called me and asked me to meet this guy who just got out of prison. He was at her office and I got him on the phone and we started talking, and I'm in the middle of working on interviewing people around sexual violence, which I do regularly. So I said to him, by any chance, did you ever experience sexual violence in prison? And he said, no, not really. But he had gone into prison when he was 17 and he had come out at 63. And he was in prison because he was selling drugs at 17 and two guys tried to steal his stash and tried to knife him and he pulled out a gun and killed them. So that cost him his life, 40 years. But you don't come back from 40 years. But anyway, when he came to my apartment an hour later and he sat down and he said, did you believe me when I told you I didn't experience sexual violence? I said, no, not really. And then he told me how he was gang raped the minute he got into prison every single day until he chose to be with someone for decades who protected him from that kind of rape, but who, whenever he wanted this guy to do him or somebody else, this guy had to do it. And as he's telling me the story, he looked at me and he said, do you think I'm still a man? And my heart was broken because the shame that men feel are different than the shame women feel. They both feel ashamed, it's just different. Women can at least talk about it. Somebody else be brave.
I'm just amazed at your ability to get the participants in the video to tell their stories so openly and honestly and vividly. And I think that in some ways that speaks to your abilities as an interviewer, and the power of having um, organizations and movements for formerly incarcerated people being led by formerly incarcerated people. So that was something that I definitely appreciated.
So a lot of people do a lot of panels on the issues, and they have sometimes almost no one who's formerly incarcerated. And the mistake people make is you can't moderate a panel on incarceration if you haven't been in it, on any part of it. You can be a smart person, you can ask questions, but what you cannot do is follow it up. So I participate in a lot of stuff, but I know where I'm going to get something done and where I'm pretty much not, because of who's on the panel. As you can tell, it's much better for me to speak as a speaker for the full time. And I don't often volunteer to be on a panel because I get 10 minutes. I don't get to say what I need to say. But as a moderator, I know what questions to ask. You know, and they're not the questions somebody else would ask. That's why you've seen a radical change or a fast-paced change in the last 5 years, particularly because of the women across this country who are formerly incarcerated and working together. So I am on a call with a national organization where women are working in every state, and we are under everybody's radar, but we're getting so much done. You know, we had one woman elected to the state Senate in the state of Washington. She's already put 5 bills in, in 1 week of being in office. She put 5 bills in and got 4 passed. Because for us, we've left friends behind. For us, I know people who are still in there. I know how much they suffer. I can't tolerate that. I personally want to blow up. I want a stick of dynamite for the prisons I was in and personally blow them up. And people will ask, well, the one popular question, 2 popular questions. What was your crime? Which I told you to stay away from that question. But the other thing is, oh, and it just went out of my head. Great. It really completely went out of my head. It'll come back. God, that's weird. All right, if we keep talking, it'll come back to me. I think you need to not settle for anything but what you want. I think people will always say when they look at legislation, well, you know, it's a first step. Well, it's been a goddamn first step for 40 years. Fuck the first step. Let's hop over to the end game. Because the end game has to be taking care of Black people, of people of color who we've allowed for decades to be prosecuted. I will tell you that I was arraigned in court with 12 Black women. There was no question in my mind I was going to be released on my own recognizance, which is called ROR. But I never saw until that moment when they sent those 12 Black women to jails without any ROR, the difference between being white and being Black. And I say this, that until we understand our privilege to its full extent in everything, just walking on the street, and make a commitment to helping those with less, making a serious commitment, an everyday commitment. And that commitment can be putting $1 into someone's hands who doesn't have $1. Little things matter so much. Kindness matters so much. People stop in my house. My address is well known. People come out of prison and stop here. I don't have a lot of money, but I give them $10, and sometimes I gave them $10 I didn't have. But I had a roof and they had to go to transitional housing. You must give more. It's not the money. They feel so happy. Give someone a meal that's not McDonald's. Give someone a meal that's not a pizza or a bagel. You know what? Well, nobody wants lobster, but I'm saying you can't imagine what people would feel to eat a piece of steak, even if it was this big, or to eat something that wasn't prison food. You know, we don't walk around worrying about what we're going to eat. We know we're going to eat. But I lived with people who didn't know that when they were going to eat. And I feel that so deeply that I have a commitment to spend every day of my life for the rest of my life trying to make a difference no matter what it takes. And I think that it's important that other people feel that way. I hope you'll go to Witness and put your name on our mailing list. I'm trying to get myself to send out an article every 2 weeks. It's not easy.
Thank you, Evie. I want to ask you one last question. And you talk a lot about how we can invest in one person, especially when they come out of prison. But what are small things that we can do to sort of interrupt incarceration and prevent people from going to prison as people on the outside?
That's not a small question. So prior to prison, you have alternatives. You want to create or be involved in the movement to create alternatives to incarceration. Oh, I know what I was going to say. The one question people, and I'll get back to that, people want to know, well, what are you going to do with the people who are murderers? And I look at them and is that your best shot, really? Because 95% of the people that are incarcerated come home. 5% of the people that are in prison probably need to be out of society, but it doesn't mean they need to sleep on a cement bed and a metal bed and a cement room. You can do what they do in Norway. You can give them a room. They can have a mattress. They can have a TV, and they can be helped. You can't just throw people out because they don't work because they're mentally ill. And anybody who's a serial killer has a mental illness. You know, you have to take. I am against prison as it is. I am for taking some people out of society, but just remember, a lot of people who are in prison were just at the wrong place at the wrong time where there was a murder, and they have a violent crime conviction and they did not commit murder. And there's too many Black women who are like that. But in answer to your question, you have to see which area you love. Do you want to keep people out of prison? In which case there's a whole host of things you can do. You want to help in conditions of confinement while they're in prison, then you want to end sexual violence, you want to end solitary confinement. Or do you want to help them rebuild their lives? That's part of reentry. So first you define where your heart is, where you think you could put in the most. And then I can give you a list of people and a list of places to work with. There in Massachusetts, one of the best people that I work with is in Roxbury, you know, who does great work. There's plenty for me to tell you if you're interested, but pick on one thing that you can do. Choose one thing and do it well. Even if it's finding someone to give a coffee to every day, you know, at a shelter, or bring a bunch of donuts to a shelter. No, don't bring them to the shelter. The staff will eat them. You have to wait till they walk outside.
Thank you, Evie. I want to thank you so much for all of your words of wisdom and for sharing your story with all of us. And I'm going to quickly pass it to Ariel, who's going to explain part 2 of our criminal justice series.
Great. Hi, guys. First of all, Evie, that was incredible. Thank you so much. And I'm going to talk about our speaker next week as part of this series is Harriet Rosetto. She founded an alternative sentencing and rehabilitation center in Los Angeles. And she just has a really incredible story of how she came to found the center and what kind of work they do there. It's a Jewish center as well. And she has really interesting information on how to go about rehabilitation in new ways that actually helps people, as we talked about today. And I will put the Facebook link in the chat. It's going to be next week on Tuesday at 7:30 p.m. And I really hope everybody can come. It's going to be really incredible.
Thank you, Ariel, and thank you everyone so much for joining us tonight. I hope all of Evie's words are staying with you, and I'll send a follow-up email with all the different action items and resources that Evie spoke about tonight, and maybe about a Zoom call next week too. Thank you, everyone.
Hi all, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much.